Psalm 18, David totally shifts gears at verse 46. In verse 45, he finishes this kind of a little bit hyperbolic, but on the other hand, much of this could have been literal. Remember how he talks about how God has given him victory, and as soon as they hear of me, they submit. Foreign nations cringe before me. They all lose their courage and come trembling from their strongholds. That's pretty, I don't know if it's exaggeration for the sake of effect, because it's possible that people literally did this. But I think the point is less, look how, I have subdued the nations, and more of, look what God has done on my behalf through me. Okay. Verse 46, total change of gears. The Lord lives. Praise to my rock. May the God of my salvation be exalted. It's been a long time, more than 20 years, since the old days when I used to lead music at camp and stuff, and there was a song we sang. The words were from the King James Version. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. Well, there's something there for us today. The Lord lives. In David's day, I think one of the things that the point of, and a part of what he meant for his readers and hearers to get is, we don't serve a dead God like the nations around us. That idol was carved out of wood. Isaiah writes interesting irony. He said, with half the wood, they carve an idol. With the other half, they burn to make bread. That's not a God. It's an idol, but it's not a God. Our God lives. How do you know that? Oh, do you remember, if you're an old person, you remember singing the song in church, you ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. Well, he does live within my heart. But here's the thing. If that's the only reason you've got for knowing that God lives, you're going to eventually get into some deep yogurt that's not going to be enough. Well, how do you know our God lives? The Lord lives. We do know this from our experience. We know this from our perceptions as well. What's the biggest reason I know God lives? I've not really pondered that question very much. One of the ways I know God lives is because he, from my experience, has sustained me through times that I look back to. I don't have any other explanation than that God took care of me. January 10th of 2011, I died, that I've been told, 3 times, was revived, I shouldn't have been revived. So I'm thinking, because it comes down to this. Either we live in a world of incredible coincidence, or else we live in a world in which God directly intervenes on behalf of people. I think he intervened on my behalf. Well, okay, that's a big reason. I'm convinced that the Lord lives. It's still subjective, isn't it? You do realize none of us are going to be able to prove the existence of God. David is not, he's not writing and saying the Lord lives in an evidentiary sort of way. This is by way of testimony. It will always require faith to believe that our God is alive and living. And if he is alive and living, then he is active in my life, in your life. Well, okay, move on, Steve. The Lord lives. Praise to my rock. David points to God as living and as my rock. Now, he didn't write the rock. He wrote my rock, that he experienced personally how solid, how substantive God is. Earlier in this psalm, he talked about a God as a rock of shelter, as a rock for hiding, as a rock of protection. And now he comes back to it. May the God of my salvation be exalted. As Christians today, whenever we read the God of my salvation be exalted, we think of salvation, I think, differently than David did. When David wrote, may the God of my salvation be exalted, what kind of salvation was he talking about? Was he talking about eternal salvation, how I am saved from sin and delivered into God's family? I don't think so. That was pretty much not the concept of the Jew in David's day. There was some, Jews believed in some kind of eternal rest, but there's the scholarship on what did Jews believe about heaven. There's a lot of ideas and possibilities for what they believed. I'm convinced that David and his, fellow Jews did not have the same concept of heaven that we do. How could they? Where did our concept of heaven come from? Well, aside from cartoons when you were a little kid, or from, somebody's exaggeration or folklore or whatever. We got our sense of what heaven is like from the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. And he only gives us a window because words fail to convey what heaven was like. It was so beyond human experience that John used earthly words to describe things that were not earthly. Well, okay. My concept, your concept of heaven, there's no way David could have had that same concept. Okay? So I'm thinking, what was, when David talks about salvation, what salvation is he talking about? Well, just using more directly the context of this song, isn't it clear? God saved him from his enemies. That was salvation, from his enemies. And so David writes, "May the God of my salvation be exalted." Does that mean that the phrase is any less valuable when you look at it that way? It's valuable in a different way than to be honest with you, I always have thought about, blessed be the God of my salvation. Thank you for saving me from hell and rescuing me to heaven. Except I don't think David could have thought that. Not in the same way we do, anyhow. Well, so let's think about it from David's perspective. First of all, how do you exalt God? To exalt means literally to lift up. How do we do that? Ever thought about that? Have you ever had to explain that to a grade school kid, or a junior high kid, or a high school kid, or an adult? To exalt God, how do you do? Well, you don't puff God up. You can't. What you do is you express your admiration, your gratitude, your reverence toward him and for him. How do you do that? Well, you do it with words. Saying in prayer to him how awed you are by him, how deeply grateful you are to him for all he does for you. It's like when you have done a good job and someone in some kind of administrative position above you comes to you and tells you that you did a great job when you did this and this and this. Well, that's exalting you. God doesn't need to be fluffed up by us. But when we, in prayer, it's worth us reflecting on what God has done, being grateful for that, acknowledging his grandeur, his greatness. The God of my salvation be exalted. It doesn't happen accidentally. You will rarely exalt God simply by accident. You have to intend to do that, and you have to take intentional steps to do that. One of the ways I find useful to me, and maybe you will find it useful to you, is in my morning quiet time, I journal. And my journal is it's a written prayer. Most of the time, I review the day just past, highlights, lowlights. I remember things that God has done in the day for my benefit and my good, and I thank him for those things. I am not as good as I intend to be at exalting him, using exultant language. But I've got a means, and it might work for you. Not everybody is. Journaling's not for everybody. I mean, Jesus didn't journal. Okay. Well, may the God of my salvation be exalted, because I will exalt him. See you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.